All right, welcome. This panel, which is organized by the Platypus affiliated society, is on Revolution Without Marx, Rousseau and his followers for the left. I'm Chris Catrone, and I'll be speaking first among the three of us. The other speakers are Spencer Leonard and Sunit Singh. Spencer will be speaking on Adam Smith and Benjamin Constant, and Sunit will be speaking on Nietzsche. I've incorporated the panel description into an introduction for my presentation, and my presentation's on Rousseau, Kant, and Hegel. Bourgeois society came into full recognition with Rousseau, who in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality and on the Social Contract opened its radical critique. Hegel wrote that the principle of freedom dawned on the world in Rousseau. Marx quoted Rousseau favorably, that whoever dares undertake to establish a people's institutions must feel himself capable of changing, as it were, human nature, to take from man his own powers and give him in exchange alien powers, which he cannot employ without the help of other men. Rousseau posed the question of society, which Adorno, for one, wrote as a concept of the third estate. Marx recognized the crisis of bourgeois society in the Industrial Revolution and the workers' call for socialism. But proletarian socialism is no longer the rising force it was in Marx's time. So what remains of thinking the unrealized radicalism of bourgeois society without Marx? Kant stated that if the potential of bourgeois society was not fully achieved as the midpoint of freedom, then Rousseau may have been right to prefer savagery against civilization's glittering misery. Nietzsche warned that we might continue to be living at the expense of the future. Quote, perhaps more comfortably, less dangerously, but at the same time in a meaner style, more basely, close quote. How have thinkers of the revolutionary epoch after Rousseau, such as Adam Smith, Kant, Hegel, Benjamin Constant, and Nietzsche himself, contributed to the possibility of emancipation in a world after Marxism? Marx's favorite quotation of Rousseau from On the Social Contract goes as follows. This is the same quotation extended, though. Whoever dares undertake to establish a people's institutions must feel himself capable of changing, as it were, human nature, of transforming each individual who by himself is a complete and solitary whole into a part of a larger whole, from which in a sense the individual receives his life and his being, of substituting a limited and mental existence for the physical and independent existence. He has to take from man his own powers and give him in exchange alien powers which he cannot employ without the help of other men. Marx wrote that this was well formulated, but only as, quote, the abstract notion of political man, concluding that human emancipation will only be complete when the real individual man has absorbed into himself the abstract citizen, when as an individual man in his everyday life, in his work, and in his relationships, he has become a species being, and when he has recognized and organized his own powers as social powers, so that he no longer separates the social power from himself as political power. So what did Marx mean by social powers as opposed to the political power from which it has been separated? A key passage from Marx's Grundrisse articulates well the new modern concept of freedom found in Rousseau. This is an extended quotation from Marx. The ancient conception in which man always appears in however narrowly narrow a national, religious, or political a definition as the aim of production seems very much more exalted than the modern world, in which production is the aim of man and wealth the aim of production. In fact, however, when the narrow bourgeois form has been peeled away, what is wealth if not the universality of needs, capacities, enjoyments, productive powers, etc., of individuals, produced in universal exchange? What if not the full development of human control over the forces of nature, those of his own nature as well as those of so-called nature? What if not the absolute elaboration of his creative dispositions without any preconditions other than antecedent historical evolution, which make the totality of this evolution, i.e. the evolution of all human powers, as such, unmeasured by any previously established yardstick, an end in itself? What is this if not a situation where man does not reproduce in any determined form, but rather produces his totality, where he does not seek to remain something formed by the past, but is in the absolute movement of becoming? In bourgeois political economy, and in the epoch of production to which it corresponds, this complete elaboration of what lies within man appears as the total alienation and the destruction of all fixed one-sided purposes, as the sacrifice of the end in itself to a wholly external compulsion. Hence, in one way, the childlike world of the ancients appears to be superior, and this is so insofar as we seek for closed shape, form, and established limitation. The ancients provide a narrow satisfaction, whereas the modern world leaves us unsatisfied, or, where it appears to be satisfied with itself, is vulgar and mean. As the intellectual historian and critic of Michel Foucault, James Miller, put it in his introduction to Rousseau, the principle of freedom and its corollary perfectibility suggests that the possibilities for being human are both multiple and literally endless. Contemporaries like Kant well understood the novelty and radical implications of Rousseau's new principle of freedom and appreciated his unusual stress on history as the site where the true nature of our species is simultaneously realized and perverted, revealed and distorted. A new way of thinking about the human condition had appeared. Another contemporary intellectual historian, Louis Menand, writing an introduction to the republication of Edmund Wilson's History of Socialism and To the Finland Station, described this new way of thinking in Marx and Engels as follows. In pre-modern societies, the ends of life are given at the beginning of life. People do things in their generation so that the same things will continue to be done in the next generation. Meaning is immanent in all the ordinary customs and practices of existence, since these are inherited from the past and are therefore worth reproducing. The idea is to make the world go not forward, only around. In modern societies, the ends of life are not given at the beginning of life. They are thought to be created or discovered. The reproduction of the customs and practices of the group is no longer the chief purpose of existence. The idea is not to repeat, but to change, and to move the world forward. Meaning is no longer immanent in the practices of ordinary life, since those practices are understood by everyone to be contingent and time-bound. This is why death in modern societies is the great taboo. An absurdity, the worst thing one can imagine. For at the close of life, people cannot look back and know that they have accomplished the task set for them at birth. This knowledge always lies up ahead, somewhere over history's horizon. Modern societies don't know what will count as valuable in the conduct of life in the long run, because they have no way of knowing what conduct the long run will find itself in a position to respect. The only certain knowledge death comes with is the knowledge that the values of one's own time, the values one has tried to live by, are expungible. Marxism gave a meaning to modernity. It said that, wittingly or not, the individual performs a role in a drama that has a shape and a goal, a trajectory, and that modernity will turn out to be just one act in that drama. Historical change is not arbitrary. It is generated by class conflict. It is faithful to an inner logic. It points towards an end, which is the establishment of the classless society. Marxism was founded on an appeal for social justice, but there were many forms that such an appeal might have taken. Its deeper attraction was the discovery of meaning, a meaning in which human beings might participate in history itself. When Edmund Wilson explained in his introduction to the 1972 edition of To the Finland Station that his book had been written under the assumption that, quote, an important step in progress had been made, that a fundamental breakthrough had occurred. This is the faith he was referring to, that Marx and Engels were the philosophs of the Second Enlightenment. Yet another contemporary scholar, Peter Proust, writing an introduction to Nietzsche's On the Advantage and Disadvantage of History for Life, pointed out that, quote, man, unlike animal, is self-conscious. He is aware that he is alive and that he must die. And because he is self-conscious, he is not only aware of living, but of living well or badly. Life is not wholly something that happens to man. It is also something he engages in according to values that he follows. Human existence is a task. The 19th century had discovered history, and all subsequent inquiry and education bore the stamp of this discovery. This was not simply the discovery of a set of facts about the past, but rather the discovery of the historicity of man. Man, unlike animal, is a historical being. Man is not wholly the product of an alien act, either natural or divine, but in part produces his own being. The task of existing is a task, precisely because it is not a case of acting according to a permanent nature or essence, but rather of producing that nature within the limitations of a situation. History is the record of this self-production. It is the activity of a historical being recovering the past into the present, which anticipates the future. Close quote. Lifting the task of human freedom in modern society out of its current historical obscurity today is difficult precisely because we have reverted to regarding ourselves as products of an alien act, and so proceed according to a model of social justice owing to the ancients' closed form and established limitation, that loses Marxism's specific consciousness of society in history. But such consciousness of history was not at all original to Marxism, but rather had roots in the antecedent development of the self-conscious thought of emergent bourgeois society in the 18th century, beginning with Rousseau and elaborated by his followers Kant and Hegel. The radicalism of bourgeois thought, conscious of itself, was an essential assumption of Marxism, which sought to carry forward the historical project of freedom. If, as Louis Menand put it, Marx and Engels were philosophers of the Second Enlightenment in the 19th century, then what of the 18th century Enlightenment, of which Rousseau was perhaps the most notorious philosopher? What remains of this 18th century legacy for the struggle to emancipate society today? The classicism of the 18th century Enlightenment had its distinctive melancholy already, reaching back in historical fragments, broken remnants of ancient forms, for inspiration to the modern task of freedom. Rilke, at the turn of the 20th century, expressed this wistful sense of modern freedom in his poem, The Archaic Torso of Apollo, which I'll now read. We cannot know his legendary head, with eyes like ripening fruit, and yet his torso is still suffused with brilliance from inside, like a lamp, in which his gaze, now turned to low, gleams in all its power. Otherwise, the curved breast could not dazzle you so, nor could a smile run through the placid hips and thighs to that dark center where procreation flared. Otherwise, the stone would seem defaced beneath the translucent cascade of the shoulders, and would not glisten like a wild beast's fur, would not, from all the borders of itself, burst like a star. For here there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. The scholar of German idealist philosophy Robert Pippin wrote that after Kant's critical turn, quote, some new way of conceiving of philosophy adequate to the realization of the radically historical nature of the human condition was now necessary. The problem of understanding properly, especially critically, conceptual, artistic, and social change was henceforth at the forefront. Close quote. This new conception was found in Rousseau. Rousseau wrote that while animals were machines wound up for functioning in a specific natural environment, humans could regard and reflect upon their own machinery and thus change it. This was Rousseau's radical notion of perfectibility, which was not in pursuit of an ideal of perfection, but rather open-ended in infinite adaptability. Unlike animal species, humans could adapt themselves to live in any environment and thus transform outer nature to suit them, thus transforming as well their inner nature, giving rise to ever new possibilities. This was the new conception of freedom, not freedom to be according to a fixed natural or divine form, but rather freedom to transform and realize new potential possibilities, to become new and different, other than what we were before. Rousseau understood the most radical possibilities of freedom and transformation to take place in society, the sight of new and alien powers which he cannot employ without the help of other men. Rousseau described this as the sacrifice of natural liberty for moral freedom, the freedom to act in unnatural ways. For Rousseau, such freedom was radically ambivalent. It could be for good or for ill. However, the problem of society in which humanity had fallen could only be solved socially, not individually. This is why Rousseau was liable to be read later antinomically. as either an anarchist or as an authoritarian. Rousseau gave expression to the radical ambiguity of freedom as it was revealed in modern society, the crossroads of civilization that bourgeois society represented. As Kant put it in his Idea for a Universal History from a Cosmopolitan Point of View, written in 1784, the same year as his famous essay answering the question, what is enlightenment? Quote, "The vitality of mankind may fall asleep until this last step to a union of states is taken, which is the halfway mark in the development of mankind. Human nature must suffer the cruelest hardships under the guise of external well-being." And Rousseau was not far wrong in preferring the state of savages, so long, that is, as the last stage to which the human race must climb is not attained. Mere civilization, however, is nothing but pretense and glittering misery. In such a condition, the human species will no doubt remain until it works its way out of the chaotic conditions of its international relations. Close quote. Rousseau was profoundly inspirational for Kant with respect to the fundamental philosophical issue of the relation of theory and practice. Specifically, Rousseau originated the modern dialectic of theory and practice, what Rousseau called their reflective and what Kant called their speculative relation. In Kant's first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason, and his summary of his argument there in reply to critics of it, the Prolegomena to any future metaphysics, Kant articulated that the conditions of possibility for concepts or categories of understanding were those of practice. What this meant in Kant was that while things in themselves were inaccessible to us, things do become objects of our theoretical understanding by virtue of being objects of our practical engagement. Objects were concrete in the sense of being concretions of the various practical and thus conceptual relations we have with them. Furthermore, as Hegel put it in The Science of Logic, objects were not identical with themselves. There was a non-identity of an object with its concept, because objects were subject to transformed, that is, changed practices. So objects were not approximations of always inaccurate theoretical models of conceptual understanding, but rather our concepts change as a function of changes in practice that are nonetheless informed by theoretical concepts. Concepts were inductive rather than deductive, because they were not abstractions from empirical observation as generalizations from experience, but rather objects were concretions of abstractions in the sense of being determined in a web of practical relations. Rationalist metaphysics had a real basis in issues of practice. Furthermore, such practical relations were social in nature, as well as subject to historical change, change which is brought about subjectively by agents of practice who transform themselves in the process of transforming objects. What objects are for subjects changes as a function of changing practical relations. In his essay, What is Enlightenment?, Kant had articulated a distinction between public and private reason in order to demonstrate that, enmeshed in the web of practical relations in society, we are condemned to exercise merely private reason in pursuit of our self-interest as individual cogs in the machine of society. It was only in the exercise of public reason that we were potentially free of such self-interest determined by our position in society, to exercise reason as anyone, as rational subjects or as political citizens, from a position transcendent of such compromised interested practice. For Kant, the exercise of public reason expressed, however indirectly, the possibility of changes in our social practices, the way things ought to be as opposed to the way they are at present. Hegel built upon Kant and Rousseau in his pursuit of the philosophy of history, trying to account for such change in freedom, or what he called reason in history. The issue of Hegelianism is a notoriously but ultimately needlessly difficult one: how to include the subjective factor in history. Hegel's sense of the actuality of the rational and the real turns on the relation of essence and appearance, or with what necessity things appear as they do to us. What is essential is what is practical, and what is practical is subjective as well as objective. In this view, theoretical reflection on the subjective dimension of experience must use metaphysical categories that are not merely handy, but actually constitutive of social practices in which one is a subject. Rousseau, in his Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, had raised a hypothetical state of nature in order to throw his contemporary society into critical relief. In so doing, Rousseau sought to bring society closer to a state of nature. Liberal bourgeois society was a model and an aspiration for Rousseau. For Rousseau, it was human nature to be free. Humans achieved a higher civil liberty of moral freedom in society than they could enjoy as animals, with mere physical freedom in nature. Indeed, as animals, humans are not free, but rather slaves to their natural needs and instincts. Only in society could freedom be achieved, and humans free themselves from their natural animal condition. When Rousseau was writing in the mid-18th century, the promise of freedom in bourgeois society was still on the horizon. Bourgeois society aspired to a proximity to the state of nature in the sense of bringing humanity, both individually and collectively, closer to its potential, to better realize its freedom. For Rousseau, in his reflections on the social contract, society exhibited a general will, not reducible to its individual members, more than the sum of its parts. Not Hobbes's Leviathan, but rather a second nature, a rebirth of potential, both collectively and individually. Human nature found the realization of its freedom in society, but humans were free to develop and transform themselves for good or for ill. For Rousseau in the 18th century revolutionaries he inspired, to bring society closer to the state of nature then was to allow humanity's potential to be better realized. But first, society had to be clear about its own aims, in practice as well as in theory. Rousseau was the first to articulate this new modern task of social freedom. The question Rousseau poses then is the speculative or dialectical relation of theory and practice today. How might we raise the originally Rousseauian question of critical theoretical reflection on our practices from within the conditions of a second nature that expresses our condition of freedom, including our self-imposed conditions of unfreedom? That is the issue of public reason today, as much as it was in Rousseau and Kant's time. I want to finish with a quotation from Hegel in his Introduction to the Philosophy of History. A long quotation. When we look at this drama of human passions and observe the consequences of their violence and of the unreason that is linked not only to them, but also and especially to good intentions and rightful aims, when we see arising from them all the evil, the wickedness, and decline of the most flourishing nations mankind has produced, we can only be filled with grief for all that has come to nothing. And since this decline and fall is not merely the work of nature, but of the will of men, we might well end with moral outrage over such a drama, and with revolt of our good spirit, if there is a spirit of goodness in us. Without rhetorical exaggeration, we could paint the most fearful picture of the misfortunes suffered by the noblest of nations and states, as well as by private virtues. And with that picture, we could arouse feelings of the deepest and most helpless sadness, not to be outweighed by any consoling outcome. We can strengthen ourselves against this, or escape it, only by thinking that, well, so it was at one time. It is fate. There is nothing to be done about it now. And finally, in order to cast off the tediousness that this reflection of sadness could produce in us, and to return to involvement in our own life, to the present of our own aims and interests, we return to the selfishness of standing on a quiet shore where we can be secure in enjoying the distant sight of confusion and wreckage. But as we contemplate history as this slaughter bench, upon which the happiness of nations, the wisdom of states, and the virtues of individuals were sacrificed, the question necessarily comes to mind, what was the ultimate goal for which these monstrous sacrifices were made? World history is the progress in the consciousness of freedom, a progress that we must come to know in its necessity. The Orientals knew that only one person is free, the Greeks and Roman only that some are free, while we moderns know that all humans are implicitly free, qua humanity. The final goal of the world, we said, is spirit's consciousness of its freedom, and hence also the actualization of that very freedom. It is this final goal, freedom, towards which all of the world's history has been working. It is this goal to which all the sacrifices have been brought upon the broad altar of the earth in the long flow of time. Hopefully still.
Adam Smith, and Smith is an odd man out. Everyone understands that Marx is a descendant of Rousseau, Kant, and Hegel. They think that Smith, on the other hand, represents something alien to Marx's tradition, that he represents the bourgeois tradition or something. This, in the last panel that I went to, drove one speaker who denied the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat to claim that Marx was inspired by romantic figures of the Scottish Enlightenment like Adam Ferguson and Sir James Stewart. And so in this paper I want to insist on, in a sense, the absolute bourgeois character of Marxist thought, which I think passes straight through Smith, and I think also is a legacy of Rousseau, unmistakably inherited by German idealism. Unlike Rousseau or even Nietzsche, Adam Smith is a thinker that few at this conference will have much time for. But this tells us more about the impoverishment of the intellectual environment that currently prevails, and about the persistently ever more obscure influence of radicalism on the left than it does about Smith. Today, of course, it's fashionable to have a critique of the Enlightenment, or alternatively to defend it. Those currents of the left that still want to lay claim to the Enlightenment, however, must fend off Smith, because, like Rousseau, ultimately his is an enlightenment that cannot be upheld as simply an affirmation of reason or the defense of human rights. Smith's enlightenment demands to be advanced.
Excuse me, Spencer.
Yes.
There's actually a panel yesterday on post-Adam Smith apples at this conference.
I know, I saw that there, and I wonder what it meant. They probably mean some kind of post-neoliberal,
Yeah.
Which I will take up in a second, what the left means by Smith. Smith's powerful influence upon French revolutionaries, such as the Abbé Sieyès and Condorcet, and through them upon Kant, Constant, and Hegel, are not as well known as they should be, but let that pass. Less well known still is the respect that Smith and his close friend Hume held for Rousseau. Hume, refusing to allow his famous public quarrel with the Genevan philosopher to cloud his judgment, dubbing his works efforts of genius in a letter to Smith. This was an estimate Hume doubtless knew would find favor with his friend, since as early as 1756, Smith had written an article that's perhaps the earliest acknowledgement of Rousseau's Discourse on the Origins of Inequality in English, singling that work out as the act whereby the French re-established their preeminence in philosophy for the first time since Descartes, displacing the preeminence of the English that had reigned for almost a century in the writings of Hobbes, Locke, Mandeville, Shaftesbury, and others. Nor did Smith's devotion to Rousseau, proclaimed in his very last publication, abate toward the end of his life. For we have the testimony of Farias de Saint-Foin from 1784, who relates, "When I was taking tea with Dr. Smith, he spoke to me of Rousseau with a kind of religious respect. Voltaire, said he, sought to correct the vices and follies of mankind by laughing at them, and sometimes even getting angry with them. Rousseau, by the attraction of sentiment and by the force of conviction, drew the reader into the very heart of reason. His contrat social will in time avenge him for all the persecutions he has suffered." Unquote. Getting to the heart of the radical specification of Rousseau's call for the conscious advance of human freedom demands that Smith interpreters get beyond the outward sobriety of the wealth of nations to the, quote, very violent attack upon the whole commercial system that lies at its core. Now, Smith had written that he'd gotten into trouble for penning a preface to the Life of David Hume, in which he affirmed Hume's atheism. And he says, "This has caused me more trouble than my very violent attack upon the whole commercial system of this society." Living in the most revolutionary society of his age, Smith was not complacent. He, no less than Rousseau, demanded a revolutionary transformation of that society. railing with all the strength of intellect against what Rousseau called our absurd civil institutions, whereby the real welfare of the public and true justice are always sacrificed to some apparent order, which is in reality detrimental to all order, and which merely gives the sanction of public authority to the oppression of the weak and the iniquity of the strong. Confession. It was in full recognition of the flagging of British philosophy, and with it of the British Revolution, that Adam Smith wrote a work that, in its own way, was not only the most revolutionary act of 1776, but is the crucial work, together with the writings of the Abbé Raynal, that link Rousseau to the French Revolution and to German idealism. Smith is one of those indispensable 18th century thinkers who articulates that century's critique of our interminable 20th, profoundly, even originally aware of the depth of the self-transformative potential of mankind. He demands that the British Revolution, and indeed Europe itself, overcome its present. Author of one of the greatest acts of public reason penned in the 18th century, Smith demands that our time, too, make a thoroughgoing attack upon the entire commercial system. Prophet of global cosmopolitanism, Smith would be outraged by the mockery made of it by globalization. Revolutionary diagnostician of the social ground of freedom, he would condemn not only statist, but no less certainly market capitalism's integral connection with and extension of its own monstrous outgrowth, the Bonapartist world state. But rather than recognize and potentially advance this critique, the desiccated thought of what passes for Marxism, or for that matter, what passes for liberalism, can only adopt a posture of knowing superiority, respecting that about which it has no idea. Take, for example, the prominent Marx scholar David Harvey. David Harvey describes Smith as a liberal utopian committed to a theology of perfectly functioning markets in the hidden hand. Supposedly a spokesman for the capitalist class, Harvey Smith promoted their exploitative system as a utopianism of process. On the basis of this liberal utopianism, we are told Smith derived a political program of give free markets room to flourish and all will be well with the world, unquote. And completing the process of stripping Smith of his specificity as an 18th century thinker, Harvey then drags him into the present, saying this, of course, is the ideology that's become so dominant in certain of the advanced capitalist countries in the last 20 years. Smith represents for Harvey a set of policy prescriptions to which presumably Harvey has other policy prescriptions to oppose. At all events, Marx mounted a devastating attack upon this utopianism of process in capital. It would be truer to say that Capital is close to Harvey, that book's leading interpreter in these spiritless times, precisely because the wealth of nations is no less impenetrable to him. That Smith represents a major stage of the labor theory of value, formulating for the first time the distinction between productive and unproductive labor, is of no concern to the likes of Harvey, who were somewhat ashamed of the labor theory of value in Marx. What this means for freeing labor to sell itself on the market unconstrained by the demands of customary privilege is utterly obscured by anachronistic talk of free market regulatory policy. As a crucial labor theorist of value, Smith proves himself an indispensable philosopher of the third estate. For him, commercial society is one grounded in the free labor of a newly emergent class, a class of city dwellers freed from the slavery of serfdom and the customary claims. The city dwellers of bourgeois of the late medieval and early modern periods sharing a common freedom, worker and merchant alike. Their society, as Smith outlines in Book 3 of The Wealth of Nations, emerges as a result of what can only be dubbed a slave revolt in what had been theretofore a relatively obscure corner of Europe. This slave revolt, incidentally, has not ceased to this day, and not just in the sense that it has spread from Western Europe to other parts of the world. The masses of mankind, including in Europe and America, have not ceased to demand a world in which they do not require the benevolence or indulgence of the baker, the butcher, the brewer, or anyone else to live their lives as they choose under law. To this day, emancipation is only available to the broad masses of the population in precisely the way in which Adam Smith demanded it, i.e., by wage labor. To this day, the great democratic demand is that people should be subject to no arbitrary power of wealth, but only to that power that possession immediately and directly conveys to the owner of money, i.e., command over labor. What Smith termed commercial society is understood precisely as the interrelationships of people exchanging the products of labor. As he famously wrote, when the division of labor has been once thoroughly established, it has been a very small part of man's wants, which the produce of his own labor can supply. He supplies the far greater part of them by exchanging. Every man thus lives by exchanging, or becomes in some measure a merchant. And the society itself grows to be what is properly called a commercial society. That such a bourgeois society is class divided represents for Smith an achievement, one that simultaneously exposes as irrational the casteist claims of all past ruling classes, and indeed of the ruling classes of his own day. If yet we still say that the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class society, they are simultaneously worthy of condemnation for having failed to have been. That is because they failed to recognize and realize themselves as class societies. They were inadequate to the concept of society itself. In other words, all wealth is originally from labor, from which after the appropriation of land and the accumulation of stock are deducted profit and rents, so that those who expect also personal deference or sexual favors in addition fail to recognize and must now be made to understand. No, this is a class society. Though the fact is inimical to most who term themselves leftists, the historical emergence of freedom was occasioned by the demand for class society, the demand for work, the demand to be subject only to the social power that properly appertains to money was allowed for that world historical liberation from community that we call the birth of the modern individual. This demand for freedom from the need to rely upon the benevolence of others, this project remains the biggest social movement on earth. Nor should it be thought that workers and those struggling for work are simply resigned to working for a master. Rather, the workers' demand for work must be viewed as simultaneously a demand for a renewed form of private property more adequate to its concept. Driven to dialectics by his struggle against the French physiocrats and British mercantilists, Smith overturns all past political economy. Though chiefly associated with the demand for free markets and invisible hand, none of this, in fact, is peculiar to his thought. It's integral to the project of the revolutionary Third Estate reaching back into the 17th century due to the mainstream concerns of political economy from the time of John Locke and Sir Dudley North in the 17th century. Similarly, the character of productive potential of the division of labor, closely associated with Smith's name, forms a subject for intense reflection and analysis nearly 3/4 of a century before the Wealth of Nations in the writings of Sir William Petty. The neglect of what is novel in Smith goes hand in hand with the one-sided rejection of liberalism and the bourgeois revolutions they brought about, and which we hope to still bring about. What is in fact central to Smith is the fundamental clarification of labor as the category at the heart of bourgeois freedom. This further specification of modern freedom reaches towards Ricardo and the Ricardian theorists of the labor movement in the 19th century more generally, inasmuch as Smith takes up the question not only of bringing class society into being, but he recognizes the Third Estate's internal capacity to grow class divided. As he notes in this long quote, "We have no acts." This is really I guess a lot of his papers inspired by Marx's Capital and writings on the theories of labor theory, the theories of surplus value, sometimes known as Volume 4 of Capital. This is something I think that actually Adorno is quite acutely aware of. what he calls the contradiction within the term, within the category of class. Smith writes, says, we have no acts of parliament against combining to lower the wages of labor, but many against combining to raise it. We rarely hear, in other words, we have laws against unionization, but we don't have laws against the ruling classes' conspiracy to drive down wages. We rarely hear, it has been said, of the combinations of the masters, though frequently of those of the workmen. But whoever imagines upon this account that masters rarely combine is as ignorant of the world as of the subject. Masters always and everywhere are in a sort of tacit but constant and uniform combination, never to raise the wages of labor. To violate this combination is everywhere a most unpopular action and a sort of reproach to a master among his neighbors and equals. We seldom indeed hear of this combination because it is the usual, one may say the natural state of things, which nobody ever hears of. The workers' combinations, by contrast, are desperate as they act with the folly and extravagance of desperate men who must either starve or frighten their masters into an immediate compliance with their demands. The masters upon these occasions are not always as clamorous, yet they never cease to call aloud for the assistance of the civil magistrate and the rigorous execution of anti-labor law. That's my double laws. A man must always live by his work, and his wages must at least be sufficient to maintain him. They must, even upon most occasions, be somewhat more than what is sufficient to maintain him. Otherwise, it would be impossible for him to bring up a family, and the race of workmen would not last beyond the first generation. The most decisive mark of prosperity of any country is the increase in the number of its inhabitants. In Great Britain and other European countries, they are not supposed to double in less than 500 years. But in the British colonies of North America, it's been found that they double in 20 or 25, nor is this increase principally owing to the continual importation of new inhabitants, but to the great multiplication of the species. Labor is there well rewarded. The demand for laborers increase. It seems still faster that they can find laborers to employ. Differences in the mode of subsistence of workers is not the cause of the effect, but the effect of the difference in wages. Though by a strange misapprehension I frequently heard it represented as the cause, it is not because one man keeps a coach while his neighbor walks afoot that the one is rich and the other poor, but because the one is rich, he keeps a coach, and because the other poor, he walks afoot. Is improvement in the circumstances of the lower ranks of the people to be regarded as an advantage or an inconvenience to the society? The answer seems abundantly plain. The liberal reward of labor, as it is the effect of increasing wealth, so it is the cause of increasing population. To complain of it is to lament over the very necessary effect and cause of the greatest prosperity. Thus, while demanding legal protection of labor's right to organize, Smith could still hope, and moreover hope in good faith, that bourgeois freedom, realized in and through the supremacy of economics, would one day lead to the emancipation of mankind. It's this commitment that confers the forthrightness upon the great scientific pronouncements of a bourgeois thinker such as Smith. But if the demand that, to the extent that emancipation is possible, if the demand for labor, to the extent that emancipation is possible, spontaneously generates lost my point. If the demand that, to the extent that emancipation is possible, there spontaneously emerges in this society a demand for class society, the realization of that demand leads to the realization that that class society itself is contradictory, not only in the sense that capital and labor are contradictory, but that the category of class is contradictory. That from being a class of competition, the bourgeoisie becomes a class of monopoly, and thereby, and as a function of that, that the working class also forces itself to become a self-monopolizing class. And that this, I think, for Smith, is really at the heart of the question of the instability of this society, an instability and a transitional crisis that Smith embraces, and that indeed the 19th century inherits.
So I should probably forego the usual caveats that everyone addresses at the beginning of a paper, but in some ways I tasked myself and goaded these two into presenting on this panel, and so I've shot myself a little bit in the foot also by sort of presenting on Nietzsche, that is presenting after Marx, right? And to think about the Rousseau after Marx, or in the wake of Marx. So, anyhow, Nietzsche came of age with the Franco-Prussian War. His first-hand experience with the savagery of war confirmed Nietzsche as the first anti-German. It also made odious the triumphalism of the rise that marked the rise of Bismarck. German self-satisfaction was, Nietzsche believed, a false sense of accomplishment. For the French defeat marked the collapse of the revolutions of 1789, 1848, and 1871, more than it heralded the advance of authentic Protestant culture. Berlin was the counterfeit New Athens. The semblance of poetry, music, and philosophy was insufficient to the eminence of the task of modern life. The victories on the battlefield were sure to exercise the spirits of 1848, but perniciously. He attacked the evasions of the 1848 revolutionaries turned anti-Semites as decadent, in bad faith, mendacious, and desperate to ape the modern. But the socialists who had turned freedom into an ethic were equally in bad faith. The dogmatic social democrat who hypostatized class relations was no different from the Protestant minister who tried to reconcile men to their wretched fate. The sustained crisis of culture, civilization, and life was evident through its symptoms: nihilism, historicism, and endless repetition. Nietzsche characterized these manifestations, as manifestations of a peculiarly modern illness, but like pregnancy is an illness, as that which had to be worked through. Nietzsche was thus reposing what had troubled Kant and Hegel after Rousseau. Does nature exhibit a telos? And what if we lived in the present day at the expense of the future? What might our values be? How might our values be the source of our enervation? If life was to be understood as a task, as Nietzsche intruded, freedom had to anticipate transformation. The crisis of value, which made modern life seem meaningless, was, after all, only a transitional stage, as he puts in The Will to Power. Nietzsche was lucid in the span that Bismarck was chancellor. This is also the era that marked the rise of social democracy, which Nietzsche polemically characterized as an indication of the decadence of this era, as a sign that the development of freedom, or of a more robust form of freedom, adequate to modernity, had stalled. It is altogether unfortunate that the reputation of Nietzsche was unable to escape the controversies that surrounded social democracy and through the revisionist debate unscathed. On one side were the revisionists with anarchist inclinations, mostly advocates of the ideas of Max Stirner, publishing in the revisionist organ, Socialist Monatshefte, who tried to appropriate Nietzsche to their cause. On the orthodox side, Franz Mehring leveled the criticism that after 1848, conservatives had turned from Hegel to Schopenhauer. As such, Nietzsche was clubbed in with those conservatives, who, unlike Marx, Engels, and Lassalle, were supposedly unable to appreciate the fact that it was not the bourgeoisie, but the working class that had a revolutionary character. The break with Schopenhauer, Mering contended, had resulted in Nietzsche placing a laurel wreath on the class of exploitation and high finance, rather than the class of the moneyed, the aristocrats, those with the moneyed class of leisure. Nietzsche was seen as putting forward a philosophy of capitalism that was elitist, but Mering was also clear that Nietzsche, quote, and I'm quoting Mering, Nietzsche is only a transitional stage on the way to socialism. This orthodoxy was reiterated by the Stalinist Lukács in the chapter From the Destruction of Reason on Nietzsche as the foundational irrationalist of the imperialist era. However, the Lukács also took the criticism of Nietzsche further, putting a different emphasis on the stakes of 1848 and thus the relationship of liberalism to socialism. Lukács followed Mering in pointing to 1848 as a watershed. The growing strength of the workers, with their peremptory insistence on socialism, marked the decline of the bourgeoisie politically. Because Nietzsche was a witness to the rise of the Socialist Party as well as the masses, but had chosen to remain a critic of these developments, ran the argument, Nietzsche was branded an elitist trying to redeem bourgeois ideology. Yet this stark distinction between bourgeois ideology and the crisis of capital is arguably itself a feature of a regression in historical consciousness. There was little indication in the Stalinist Lukács, at least, that both Nietzsche and Marx were grappling with what Lukács of History and Class Consciousness had referred to as the antinomies of bourgeois thought. Lukács, the dialectician, had seen that when Marx was pushing the revolution to take its poetry from the future, this was not a call for the workers to distance themselves from the demands articulated in the course of the bourgeois democratic revolution, but rather a call for a clearer historical consciousness of the crisis of capital after the Industrial Revolution. And in a sense, this insight is also something that sort of Nietzsche contends with in his own way, in the way that he deals with the exhaustion of the bourgeois democratic revolution through the parliamentary framework and the form that it takes in the authoritarian regime of Bismarck. The kind of Bonapartist authoritarianism of Bismarck. And Nietzsche was, in this sense, a typical liberal of the 19th century, someone who was ambivalent about the status of the individual against the collective, herd society, and concerned about authoritarianism. And like Marx, Nietzsche was pointing toward the realization, the completion, and the transfiguration of the values of liberal emancipation. The criticisms of Nietzsche as an elitist, anti-democratic, and anti-left conservative are rehabilitated in the present day by Malcolm Bull. He argues in Anti-Nietzsche that Nietzsche, depicting himself as a predatory bird of prey, advocates, quote, an all-out war against the defenseless out of a hatred. Right? Postmodernists who see Nietzsche as one of their own, avant la lettre, Bull argues, are projecting their own psychology, identifying themselves as the last men or the overmen. Bull asserts that whereas Durkheim articulated a cautious optimism about the totalization of society based on organic solidarity, Nietzsche wanted a return to mechanical solidarity, which is to say that Durkheim, for Bull, was a theorist of difference, while Nietzsche advocated the reimposition of slavery in the modern era, the return of the caste society of Brahmins. Bull recycles criticisms of Nietzsche that express an ambivalence about the possibility of the project of freedom itself. And in this sense, he thinks, that Durkheim, by having this kind of encompassing view of what society will turn out to be, that society had not in fact become more immoral, right? As Durkheim argues, right, that despite the transformations and what the Durkheim characterizes as a pathology of transition, we haven't in fact become more immoral, right? But for Bull, this becomes the idea that we now have somehow, that Durkheim represents a more complete sense of the task of freedom. We might differ from Bull here, right? There's no sense, I'm arguing, that imposing an invidious choice, Marx and the left or Nietzsche. We might productively follow Adorno, who in the roundtable discussion on Nietzsche between the transplanted members of the Frankfurt School in the summer of 1942, it's a debate that in fact there are these kind of subtle references in fact to the fact they were aware of the stakes of the revisionist controversy over Nietzsche interpretation, right? So there's several references to Ibsen, meaning that Nietzsche was considered a theorist of the individual versus the collective, and so there's this kind of, there are moments in which this registers in this otherwise cryptic kind of roundtable discussion. But anyhow, sorry. In the course of that discussion, Adorno chided Marcuse for putting the matter of the relation of Nietzsche to Marx as an either-or choice. Adorno argues that Nietzsche addresses the crisis of modern civilization by identifying aspects that were not explicitly there in the critique of political economy, and that Nietzsche elevates the issues of the relationship of communism and anarchism to a new level precisely insofar as culture is treated as a serious category. Nietzsche remains valid, in other words, unless and until Marx and the desiderata that he had identified are unfulfilled, are left unfulfilled. Moreover, Adorno repeatedly implored we had to do the work to decipher the ways in which Nietzsche wrestled with the crisis of civilization after 1871. Nietzsche was separated from Marx by the crisis of 1848, but articulated a philosophy of freedom which could be understood in consonance with the Marxist project. Is what I want to sort of briefly outline somehow. Nietzsche was invested, we might argue, in the project of the dialectic of enlightenment. He was, in other words, attempting to think through the historical inversions, the self-destructiveness and self-transformation, and the manner in which we had to overcome nature. Zarathustra, and this is characterized man as, quote, a rope stretched between animal and the Superman, a rope over an abyss. How is one to cross this abyss? For Nietzsche, the development of man is neither the result of accidental change or Heraclitan flux or simply the actualization of potentiality. It is the consequence of the historical development of our distinct plasticity, which Rousseau characterized as our perfectibility and our distinct capacity to mimic other species. Our transformation of nature, that is, through our manipulation of nature, is both a development in but also beyond nature. We had to self-overcome our own nature. And Nietzsche cautioned, of course, in the, forgive me, I wanted to sort of read out, so along with this as I said, this project of thinking through the historical inversions, etc., Nietzsche demanded in this sense that this crisis that presented itself as nihilism, as cynicism, he sort of calls it different things at different points, that this peculiarly modern illness had to be situated within the 10,000-year history of humanity, for most of which the actions of men were considered to be of little significance. It was rather their outcome, right? And so he says in a passage that we, of course, circulate and read in the reading group from Beyond Good and Evil, section 32, where he says, during the longest period of human history, so-called prehistorical times, the value or disvalue of an action was derived from its consequences. The action itself was considered as little as its origin. It was rather the way a distinction or disgrace still reaches back from a child to its parents. In China, it was the retroactive force of success or failure that led men to think well or ill of an action. Let us call this period the pre-moral period of mankind. The imperative know thyself was as yet unknown. In the last 10,000 years, however, one has reached a point, step by step, in a few large regions on Earth, where it is no longer the consequences but the origin of an action that one allows to decide its value. On the whole, this is a great event which involves a considerable refinement of vision and standards. The unconscious after effect of the rule of aristocratic values and the faith in dissent, the sign of a period that one may call moral in the narrower sense. It involves the first attempt at self-knowledge. Instead of the consequences, the origin. Instead, a reversal of perspective, and certainly a reversal achieved only after long struggles and vacillations. And he goes on to say, I'll skip down a little, the overcoming of morality in a certain sense, even the self-overcoming of morality. Let this be the name for that long secret work which has been saved up for the finest and most honest, also the most malicious consciences of today, as living touchstones of the soul. So, and he goes on to caution, of course, in the Genealogy of Morals, that all spiritual advances are, of course, bought at the expense of blood and more blood. Right? And this is, someone like Bull, of course, takes this to be indicative of some kind of euphemistic impulse in Nietzsche. We might argue that, in fact, the elitism here is a recognition of the loneliness of the task. Of course, to confront this task of modern life properly, for Nietzsche, entailed a critical approach to history from a supra-historical stance. And here we might recognize the proximity of Hegel's philosophy of freedom and of history to Nietzsche's own conception of genealogy here. And we can see that Nietzsche asks, how is the new form of historical consciousness in the uses and abuses of history for life, how is the new form of historical consciousness, which is exemplified by a certain kind of right Hegelianism, a symptom of unfreedom? And he argues, of course, that our attempt at self-transformation changes history and what that history means for the future. And here the inner affinities between Hegel and Nietzsche are to be noted, as is his kind of anti-Hegelianism. Not his anti-Hegel stance, but a rather anti-Hegelianism, right? That Hegel, too, was conscious of a task of history, in history, and the self-transformation of history in the present. The extent to which Nietzsche takes issue with both Hegel and also the, in section 9 of the uses and abuses of history for life, Hartmann and Stirner, is the extent to which there's a kind of evident affirmation of the world process. And he says, to affirm the world process, those who hold a kind of affirmative view of history have first of all, he says that they have the personality of a flea beetle, in a kind of classic kind of Nietzschean way, and then, that a Dionysian affirmation of the world as it is a formula for amor fati, right? Our fate, in a sense. I guess I want to simply move forward quickly by saying that if we think about this idea of the inner affinities between Hegel and Nietzsche, and therefore, and by extension, to Rousseau, Nietzsche's object of criticism is rather the academic and kind of intellectual historicism that he sees in his own day. Right? So this is a kind of the Ronchian notion of history, or an affirmative view of history, and where we see Nietzsche sort of, whereas he argues that Hegel attempts to supersede the contradiction between Romanticism and Enlightenment in society and culture, Nietzsche saw the greatness of the Greeks as the self-overcoming of the Orient, so as to see bourgeois society as the basis of its own self-overcoming, based on this critical, supra-historical, historical consciousness. So the continuity between Nietzsche and Hegel can be summarized as their concern with freedom. And the philosophical difference between them, of course, lies in the consciousness of history. For Hegel, the romantic view was perhaps a necessary stage, whereas for Nietzsche, this had already degenerated into melancholy. And the gulf that separates them, of course, is the gulf of the 19th century. On the one side stand Marx and Nietzsche, and on the other side stands Hegel. For Nietzsche, then, unlike Hegel, who had little concern with the question of the future, Nietzsche sees the question of the pathos of the future as a task. And he asks, are we the first comers? How is the 19th century anticipating the future? And he concludes, sort of in conjectures, he says, perhaps our word man, from the Sanskrit manas, still expresses something of precisely a feeling of self-satisfaction, arguably that Rousseau had. Man designated himself as the creature that measures values, evaluates and measures, as though evaluating animal as such. And the need for historical consciousness here, he sort of, I've left out a rather long quote from the Uses and Abuses of History for Life. Do I have? Okay. Which I'd like to conclude with. Only the man whose breast is oppressed by a present need and who wants to cast off his load at any price has a need for critical history. That is, history which sits in judgment and passes judgment. A person must have the power and from time to time use it to break a past and to dissolve it in order to be able to live. He manages to do this by dragging the past before the court of justice, investigating it meticulously, and finally condemning it. That past is worthy of condemnation, for that is how it stands with human things. In them, human force and weakness have always been strong. Here it is not righteousness which sits in the judgment seat, or even less mercy which announces judgment, but life alone, that dark, driving, insatiable, self-desiring force. For when its past is analyzed critically, then we grasp that knife at its roots and go cruelly beyond all reverence. It is always a dangerous process, that is, a dangerous process for life itself. And people or ages serving life in this way by judging and destroying a past are always dangerous and in danger. For since we are the products of earlier generations, we are also the products of their aberrations, passions, mistakes, and even crimes. It is impossible to lose oneself from this chain entirely. When we condemn that confusion and consider ourselves released from it, then we have not overcome the fact that we are derived from it. In the best case, we bring the matter to a conflict between our inherited customary nature and our knowledge. In fact, even to a war between new strict discipline and how we have been brought up and what we have inherited from time immemorial. We cultivate a new habit, a new instinct, a second nature, so that the first nature atrophies. It is an attempt to give oneself, as it were, a pass after the fact, out of which we may be descended in opposition to the one from which we are descended. It is always a dangerous attempt because it is so difficult to find a borderline to the denial of the past and because the second nature usually is weaker than the first. Too often what remains is a case of someone who understands the good and without doing it because we also understand what is better without being able to do it. But here and there, victory is nevertheless achieved. And for the combatants, for those who make use of critical history, for their own living, there is an even remarkable consolation. Namely, they know that first nature was at one time or another once a second nature, and that every victorious second nature becomes a first nature.
All right, I think that we'll just open it up for questions now.
first of all, one question, which is a logical clarification. In terms of when you were discussing class society, I mean, my sense is that in the way you're using class society, you wouldn't call any society before bourgeois society in history a class society. So that by your use of the term, which might confuse people, to say feudal society wouldn't be a class society. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was distinguishing it from casteist society.
So you wouldn't call like the feudal aristocracy of the 13th century in Europe a ruling class.
The point is that they're not a class. They're a caste. It's not that they're not ruling. Of course, they're ruling. The issue is that are they? Smith's distinctions. The point that Smith is making is that the components of price are profit and the wages, profit, and rent. The 13th century aristocracy is not merely a rent-collecting class. In that sense, it's not a class.
Okay, no, I understand the
It has
distinction.
all kinds of prescriptive rights or claims upon other castes in relation to them and in relation to nature.
Okay, that was my main point, but I just wanted, because I think the way people use the word class, some people might have been confused by that. I understood the meaning, because I'm familiar with Platypus. I guess the open question that I have, which I've been thinking about, this is not to make a particular point, the Platypus narrative, the narrative you laid out, which is basically about the radical enlightenment background to Marxism, and the crisis it undergoes in the 19th century, and that's where Marx and Nietzsche end up. I guess my question is, like, that's a narrative about the discovery of freedom, historicity. Part of the background to the crisis is this notion of the rise of the commodity form and the transformation of it through the Industrial Revolution. I guess one specific historical question is, how does, say, the 17th century and sort of the British Revolution of the 17th century, or Spinoza, or the radical early Enlightenment play into that narrative of the Enlightenment? And the other question connected to that, which is the real big question, is this talk about history, nature rather. And I guess part of that, the parallel process, which certainly influences one conception of modernity, is how does the rise of natural science and of a natural scientific view of the world affect, how is that related to the Enlightenment and to the problem of human freedom? Because I think that is also a part of the background of Marxism, even if it's something that's taken for granted.
I guess I would just say something about, with regard to the 17th century and the 18th century, that when looking at the bourgeois revolution in the 16th and 17th century, the Dutch Revolt and the English Civil War, that the bourgeois revolution is conducted under the auspices of a restoration of true Christianity. It inherits the consciousness and terminology of the Protestant Reformation in a way that the 18th century Enlightenment is different. It no longer aspires to the restoration of true Christianity, but rather to the restoration of nature. In other words, the language of Christianity is replaced by the language of nature, and that's significant, and that we have to account for that in some way. I think that, personally, my take on it is that that marks bourgeois society becoming conscious of itself. And so what's the Marx phrase, from Habakkuk to Locke, right? That we have to distinguish between the 17th and the 18th century in that respect. I'll leave aside the question of natural science, because I think the scientific revolution is contemporaneous with the bourgeois revolution in the longue durée, and is obviously related to it, but is neither reducible to it, nor is it nor is that reversible in its reducibility. In other words, bourgeois society is not just the rise of technique, freed from traditional custom, but rather it's a complex of social relations in which the liberation of technique is a component part. And I would also say that the concept of nature is not the natural scientific or physical scientific one, because nature is understood as a category not of physics, but also of history.
Right. Just if I could add on, I'll speak with Smith. For Smith, in a sense, and I think it's a very bourgeois perspective that Hegel articulates in terms of the owl of Minerva flying in the dusk. In a sense, folly precedes consciousness, right? That in terms of the rise of the modern world, the way that Smith treats it is, well, there's the search for El Dorado, right? That drives people across oceans, that discovers a new world, that interconnects the globe. And to the extent that people are acting consciously to create bourgeois society, they're doing so in the narrowest of terms, right? In the consciousness of a slave revolting, right? Escaping the immediacy of direct domination. And it's only much later that that freedom comes into crisis in I think he thinks in Rousseau and in himself, right? That the specification of what is it that is modern, what is modern society is a central part of the task of the post-Rousseauian thinkers, right? What are our historical circumstances? And part of Smith's relation to Rousseau is his attempt to specify the Rousseauian question in relation to commercial society, right? That what we are, what has happened, the form in which we're enslaving ourselves now is as the buyers and sellers of products of labor. And the way in which we're going to emancipate ourselves is by advancing the project of being buying and sellers of products of labor. In other words, presuming labor to be a commodity already.
Maybe just make a brief clarification. Two things were lying behind my question. One is that there was certainly a postmodernist move, which maybe is over, of looking to Spinoza, like in French thought, that sort of like this whole Spinoza fetish that sort of comes, which seems like a kind of post-Marxist take. It doesn't really seem to me to have that much to do with Spinoza, but there is this kind of move towards Spinoza as a seminal thinker of modernity or critic. And the other aspect is that in terms of the understanding, or self-understanding, or misunderstanding of Marxism, the idea of Marxism itself as a science and a kind of scientistic understanding of Marxism or critique of Marxism as scientific also plays a big role in terms of particularly the Second International. And that's sort of why I brought up the question of like how, so I'm not really concerned so much with the question of technique, which you emphasize. It's not that bourgeois society is equivalent to a change in technique, but it's sort of how does the fact of the dominance of science affect like an enlightenment world view?
I just put it this way, and I think it's very much a Rousseauian point. The cognition of society, which has to do with this question of the achievement of class relations, right, of rendering relations of domination class relations, that is simultaneously to bring into view both society and nature.
Okay.
Right, and that's what Rousseau's point
Steve,
is.
do you have a point?
I just for example, one thing that's always struck me is the way Voltaire had this sort of fascinating admiration for Newton, which he didn't really understand, but he had this sort of sense of Newton as parallel to some Voltairean project. Whereas you don't find that in Rousseau. Like, not that Rousseau had any problem with Newton, but you don't find in Rousseau that sense of some kind of parallel. And I just sort of wonder like what seems to be the deep structure of that. And I think it has to do with how one conceives of freedom or something. Because Rousseau, I would say, is a more radical thinker than Voltaire.
And Smith may be more radical probably than Newton.
There are other questions? Yeah, another question.
I wasn't able to pay close attention because I was a bit sleep deprived. But anyway, I will ask my questions and make some comments. Undoubtedly, Marx, or rather Rousseau, Marx and Nietzsche are all parts of modernity, and they're concerned with the question of human freedom. But I'm not sure if they're part of the same tradition. And I wanted to ask Sunim, where do you place Nietzsche in the genealogy of morals in this narrative you expose on? I mean, Nietzsche's understanding of human emancipation, or rather realization, human realization, doesn't see the working class as the agent of that emancipation, which is key in Marx, right? So that's one remark I want to make. As far as Rousseau goes, in the origins of inequality, I believe he understands human nature as something concrete. Yes, there is a second nature and a first nature, but there is a core in the first nature. While in Marx, human nature is perceived as tabula rasa, something totally flexible, which notion in a sense led to the tragedies of the 20th century. So, I mean, we cannot be Rousseauian and Nietzschean and Marxist at the same time. I mean, so these are my comments.
Yeah, I guess I would go back to where does Nietzsche situate himself in the genealogy of morals, and it's in the third section of that essay, right, where he is in fact saying that, look, the asceticism of modernity is in fact where he's kind of linking himself with that tradition and saying that philosophy are the inheritors of this asceticism, which is an attempt to make sense of the meaningless of life, right? It's posing the question. It's an attempt, I mean, to simply ask the question about, to confront nihilism is an attempt to make sense of this crisis. Let's just say specifically about the genealogy, but I mean, are they all of the same tradition? I would say that, if we didn't have Marx, then what would we be left with in terms of a critique of modern society, and we would be left with Nietzsche, I'd argue, right? That in fact, one could put it in the way that Spencer puts it sometimes, right? That in fact, Marx is, Nietzsche is what Marx would be if he didn't have Engels, right? If he didn't have the critique of political economy that sort of excited him, right? When he first read Engels. So I think that we would have to think about the distance that separates us from the moment in which a Mehring or even Adorno is saying, Adorno's posing that question of, well, in fact, for the Second International, it may well have been the case that you couldn't be a Nietzschean and you couldn't be a Marxist at the same time. But in the failure of Marx, right, in the failure to realize the desiderata of what Marx identifies, the bourgeois emancipation, what are you left with? You have to look to someone like Nietzsche, I would argue.
Well, I guess that the other point would be about, now when I then speak to the Rousseau, the left Hegelian influence for Nietzsche. I think just to decrypt what you said about, without Engels, Marx might have well been Nietzsche. Without Engels, without that productive relationship, Marx may not have transcended left Hegelianism in the way that he did through the critique of political economy. So on Rousseau, with respect to first nature versus the tabula rasa, it's interesting because this is controversial. Some readers do think that Marx has an Aristotelian notion of human nature, and has is too much of a Feuerbachtian, or there are different accounts of this. Rousseau's concept of first nature is also eminently plastic. In other words, everything that you could accuse 20th century actually existing socialism of doing, you could also accuse the Jacobins of doing. Pity and perfectibility are radically underspecified. perfectibility is open-ended, and pity is this empathy that can be compassionate or it can be sadistic and cruel. It's a source of pride in society, etc. So again, the tabula rasa view with respect to Marx could also be attributed to Rousseau and all the problems of revolutionary terror that attach. Could be said of the French Revolution as well as of the Marxist revolutions of the 20th century. And so it's not a question of the same tradition, so much as it's a question of the accumulation of history, and how Nietzsche is the bad conscience of the era of Marxism, to use his own category. Anyway, other questions?
If I could just add to this, I think that one way of putting it would be that, since the panel is saying revolutionary politics without Marx, the revolutionary tradition without Marx, but another way of putting it is if, as I think is palpably the case, that Marxism cannot be advanced today, can any bourgeois philosophical project be advanced? Right? They may not be the same tradition, and this is what I think is implicit in the idea that maybe you couldn't be a Marxist and a Nietzschean at the same time in 1900, but now there's no way to advance the project of freedom as inherited from bourgeois philosophy at all.
Right, in other words, it's not a question of advancing bourgeois thought as opposed to Marxism, but rather they both end up in the same kind of static.
To all of the, in a sense, sort of pygmy Philistine professors that want to find license in Hobbes or Spinoza or this gimmick or that gimmick, and we're basically saying, look, this is a philosophical tradition that actually depended upon conditions in history for its intelligibility at all.
Sure. Two things, and I hope people will be patient with me. The first is I feel like I've walked in on a discussion between Richard and Spencer that I don't know the background of, and I want to just get clarification if somebody will provide it. But I've certainly always thought of feudal rulers, the aristocracy or the church as components of a class.
Or the church,
rather than a caste. Well, the hierarchy of the church.
Right? Because
right.
It's kind of like, well, what is the church a ruling class? But anyway, no.
No, the church is not a ruling class. But
And yet it was the top caste.
It is an estate.
It is the top caste. Anyway, go ahead.
So, anyways, I do think it's an important point, and I don't know if this gets to what you guys are actually talking about, that it's not the way it subjectively identifies itself, but whether the objective category, has a validity in examining past societies. I know that there are certainly contradictions even in what we would consider to be orthodox Marxist writings when it comes to the so-called Asiatic mode of production. But, I think that when Chris says that the English Civil War or the revolt of the Netherlands are done within the context of religious ideology, certainly I agree with that, but I think what is the motive force that's working behind it, and I do think that it's in class terms, and that the clarifying moment of the French Revolution is really the fact that it rips aside a lot of that false ideology, and that the participants and witnesses actually are describing it frequently within class terms, that you can have a babouf, which is at a qualitatively higher level than the diggers or the ranters, etc., from my perspective anyways.
Sayez is too. Sayez also.
So, and also that by that point you begin to be able to have historical chronologies of, say, past struggles like the Revolt of the Netherlands by Schiller, that implicitly reinforces the idea that this is something that has occurred within class terms. The second point, and I found it interesting, I did not know what to expect when coming to the panel. I recall being a teenager and, on the one hand, going to demonstrations in solidarity with the Sandinistas, and on the other hand, sitting in my bedroom and reading Nietzsche. And Nietzsche really spoke to the alienation that I felt, and it was really much later, maybe 2 or 3 years later, but qualitatively a lifetime later in terms of your political development, reading Sartre and Trotsky side by side, and reading Novak on existentialism, and kind of having a reconciliation. And I certainly believe that Nietzsche has been slandered, in terms of the implications of anti-Semitism and that sort of thing. But I do have to say that things happen within a historical context, and Nietzsche to me is in fact a product of a reactionary despair following the defeats of 1848 and 1871, and his retreat into an individualistic realm of trying to deal with these things that do recognize some of the same things in Hegel that Marx does, but he doesn't have a program, and it's the program that is in fact essential. And I do think that says something about the way that I perceive Platypus, and I feel like I've been on a broken record on this. But the Frankfurt School also, and particularly the Frankfurt School in exile, after World War II, is in contradiction to Trotskyism and I think the best revolutionary traditions by that same product of despair, by the fact that these are people who are living in exile in host countries that are on the other side of the Cold War in very difficult circumstances, and that the lesson that they take from this midnight of the century is a lesson of despair, and a lesson that pulls them out of concretely organizing to change the world. From my perspective, I realize that subjectively they probably thought the dialogues they were having were in some way advancing a discourse towards change. But, and whatever the faults of Trotskyism are, and there were faults certainly in the way that the leading sections perceived the world after World War II, I think it continues in the way that Marx continued to grapple with the idea of what to do after 1848. What do you do after the degeneration of the Russian Revolution? What do you do after the massive defeat of the workers' movement, represented by the 1930s and 1940s?
Well, maybe we add one more question to that. What do you do in the absence of Marxist left?
Do you have any comments about Trotsky's brief essay from 1900 on Nietzsche?
The eulogy,
No, I do not. One of the things that I know that Ross, in fact, I think circulated some other Trotsky writings on Nietzsche that I intended to sort of look at, but didn't. Do you want me to address the question of despair? And ultimately, I do think that Nietzsche is not up to taking on the task of freedom in the way that Marx was. But that we might ask ourselves, as I was saying, if there's the question of, well, what does it mean to sort of take on the task of freedom in the absence of the left, then we might in fact all be back at the, thrown back into, as individuals, to have to contend with this accretion of defeats. And so in that sense, Nietzsche is, in posing the question of how does Nietzsche help us think about that, right? Is the way that I was putting it, right? And I don't know that
I would say something about Marxism itself. I think that the roundtable discussion of the Frankfurt School in exile in the 40s about Nietzsche, where Adorno says, look, as long as Marx is invalid, Nietzsche remains valid. The idea is that Marxism itself is an ideology. In other words, it's an ideology in Marxian terms, in Marx's own terms, a necessary form of appearance. And in other words, that there was a necessity to the self-consciousness of the socialist workers' movement that Marx expressed. Now, it's not just the absence of a Marxist left, or the absence even of a socialist workers' movement, it's the absence of a left that then makes the necessity of such an ideology as Marxism tenuous at best, right? I guess to get back to a point that Spencer was raising about Marxism and bourgeois thought, that it's not a matter of continuing the project, but rather a matter of recovery. And the recovery is quite uncertain. So, I wouldn't characterize Trotsky himself as a despairing character, but I do think that there's a character desperation and despairing to Trotskyism, the post-Trotskyism that has to be acknowledged. And so in that respect, maybe to get back to the very initial point, subjective or objective, I mean, I guess the Hegelian point would be that you can't quite separate these. In other words, it's a dialectic of subject and object, that it's not a matter of, oh, well, subjectively, the Dutch burghers were Christians, but objectively, they were capitalists, or something like that. No, subjectively and objectively, they were Christians, and in retrospect, subjectively and objectively, they're capitalists. Right? And so, you know, it's not a linear kind of phenomenon that we're dealing with.
Another way of putting that is that the form of their Christianity as a revolutionary project is what generates the consciousness that allows us to say that they weren't.
Right.
They weren't. I mean, in other words, they gave birth to the 18th century. I mean, the 16th and 17th century revolts led to the 18th century, and led to a crisis of the 18th century. I think that was really Spencer's point, which is that Rousseau and Smith are both articulating a crisis of the bourgeois revolution in the 18th century. It's a different crisis from Marx's crisis, but it is a crisis, meaning, how is it that Hegel puts it about the English? They think that they're free in the sense of having freedom as a possession, but insofar as they think of freedom as a possession rather than as a task, they've gone to sleep. Or they're like middle-aged men who have put the dreams of youth behind them and are just waiting to die. That's the way Hegel puts it in the Introduction to the Philosophy of History, meaning that the English Revolution, which is, in a sense, the fact of the 18th century, is also falling below its own threshold, is also going to sleep in the 18th century, and that both Rousseau and Smith are testament to that. And the fact that the English then are the counter-revolutionaries with the French Revolution is also significant, as well as in the American Revolution, obviously. You know, because I'd say that not only is it the French Revolution and not only Babeuf that is, you know, in a sense, this revolution conscious of itself, but also the American Revolution represents the degree to which it's a Lockean revolution, represents a transformed consciousness. It's no longer a Christian revolution, regardless of what American conservatives might want to believe. And these are atheists.
If I could just say, one of the points that I was trying to make is that, in a sense, the consciousness, self-consciousness of bourgeois society is as a crisis. And what I mean by that is that Smith is clear about the fact that, you know, on the one hand, he's arguing about competition, and that, of course, the real point being is that people can't be held down as slaves or servants. That's the point about competition, right? That there needs to be freedom in the labor market. But at the same time, he's saying that the capitalist class, which at some level is like very rationality is identifiable with the notion of market competition, has an inherently anti-competitive impulse vis-a-vis the working class, which itself provokes the working class becoming monopolizing labor and refusing to sell it except collectively.
It's also the question of the merchant interest, right? Or the critique of mercantilism. Because I was just teaching Smith last week, and I was struck by the fact that he has this sense that bourgeois society could either think of itself as laboring or as mercantilist, as merchants. And you know, he talks about how the polity is captured by the merchant's interest, and that this is against the interest of society as productive. And he calls it the shopkeeper's interest also.
Right, I think that he wants to push this project of laboring society in self-consciously recognizing that that doing so is pushing into a contradiction, not into some sort of theology, of a theological, you know, magical system in which things just. This is the real point that Harvey doesn't understand, is that this is willing the crisis of civilization, right? You know, that's saying behind domination, even though they didn't know it, yes, we can say that they were collecting rent and collecting profits in ancient Babylon. Even though they had no consciousness of that, and they didn't organize their society in that way. And we had to abolish ancient Babylon in order to get profit and rent collectors. At the same time, in so doing, we're immediately provoking the crisis of those very categories of all hitherto existing civilizations, and doing so willingly.
Okay.
There might be another question.
I wanted to ask.
There are a couple more questions.
No, I was going to say, right, I think that that quote in the Adorno essay, I think it's in the Post-Industrial Society, Post-Industrial Capitalism, the issue of the pyramids, how the pyramids...
No, it's reflections on class theory.
Class theory,
That
yeah.
in regarding the pyramids, you hear the noise of the factory.
Right, or in other words, that like what they become is congealed labor time.
Right.
Like the pyramids weren't obviously subjectively conceived of as congealed labor time, but as a result of historical development, the very object that one is trying to transform, i.e. all of hitherto human history, looks as if, it's congealed labor time. That's not the point that I wanted to make. I just wanted to clarify, I think that that's what Spencer is trying to say about Smith. I mean, in a sense, it's interesting to post Smith in this way, because you're right, he does kind of fit sort of in a strange way. If the point of Smith saying that finally you have kind of class society and its potential transparency in order to actually transform the object, that you reveal basically that social antagonism is actually based on class society. All of the appendages, all of the sort of ornamentality of what otherwise is defined as caste or what may have you, can finally be addressed as class society.
Right, the aristocrats are not warriors and hunters.
Right.
But they're just rent collectors.
Right.
Their
advantage-
waters of bourgeois rationale.
Their capacity to administer society, in other words, is not based on their destined whatever. I wanted to just say, because I think that one of just the panel kind of raises the question of okay, so what is Marx, right? Because in a negative way, it's okay, so there's this, and in the last point that Sunit made about the relationship between first nature and second nature, in some extent, you could talk about the relationship that Chris pointed out in Kant between that of the subject and the object. That is, that objects are subject to practice, and that's how one gets to sort of know the object. But as a result of that process, that subject itself changes. As a result of participating in that praxis and the transformation of the object, the subject changes. And for Hegel, this transformation didn't happen in a kind of vacuum, but it happened kind of in a historical development. So the unraveling itself, presented a dynamic. And it seems to me that for Nietzsche, his intervention in this is that, one has to also pay attention to the direction of the change, or the direction of the subject-object relation, the direction of the transformation. So whereas Hegel, or what had come to be known as a kind of Hegelian thought, or Hegel himself being alive at the time, that this sort of uninterrupted progress, or kind of moving path of spirit, that for Nietzsche there was a kind of suspect about being able to advance and overcome certain problems. And so it's interesting because yes, although he locates the problem in terms of bourgeois society, at the end of the day, it does become an issue of the bad consciousness of Marxism, right? Insofar as Marx was attempting to fulfill and not undermine or undo the gains of bourgeois society, that the fulfillment of bourgeois society, this is what Nietzsche is raising a question about. Is, the presence of Bismarck and the authoritarianism of this age, is that the fulfillment of bourgeois society? And if it isn't, then, what does it say about this potential progress? And so in the context of that sort of framework, what is Marx? It seems to me that, and this is where Lukács comes in, at least for Platypus, and thinking about this, that insofar as you had, finally, right, in Smith's term, class society, in which you have a proletarian class, that showed itself to be like potentially kind of object and subject of history in this formulation, that the advancement or the sort of the direction of history, the direction of the change, could happen through a working class politics. That's how you mastered that potential, through the working class politics. And insofar as that doesn't happen, it just raises the issue of what kind of critique of bourgeois society is possible.
Nietzsche kind of contradicts himself, because on the one hand, he does have in mind the affinity of Bismarck and socialism, which you find in Bismarck and Lassalle, and recognizes that in a sense the anti-bourgeois are the ultimate bourgeois. Well, Lassallean socialism is the ultimate bourgeois. But at the same time, he thinks that repetitive labor is the activity most suited for moderns, because it's experienced as therapeutic.
Because it's sort of transition, sort of stuck. The sort of,
it allows them to experience their nihilism as if it were fate. Right.
Or in Benjamin's Nietzsche sort of like that, you rehearse the problem of transformation, right, over and over to some extent to be able to experience.
Benjamin adding Freud into the mix. There was another question.
Make it as a better.
Oh, I guess we need to
clear
shortly.
We at least have Ben's question on.
Oh, Ben. Well,
yeah.
Oh, yes, I didn't see your hand.
I mean, maybe it will take us like somewhat of a field from where the conversation last was, but I guess I wanted to ask a little bit about the subjective side of things and the kind of historical trajectory that you guys are kind of portraying here from Rousseau to Nietzsche. I mean, one of the things that we discussed in the pedagogy surrounding these figures in this kind of historical epoch is the development of alienation, or the development of a change in the ways of appearance, the necessary forms of appearance. And so I kind of wanted to, because it's a little bit, it's like not exactly present in the portrayal of the continuity of these figures in the presentations, that there is a qualitative shift from the way society appears to Smith, or the way freedom appears to Rousseau, versus the way that it appears in forms of misrecognition to Nietzsche as a function of actual transformations in the subjective-objective kind of dialectic of society across the period of Marx, right? Across the 1848 revolutions, across the development of industrial society. So I'm wondering, I guess I'm wondering two things. One being, if what we're saying is this is a thought experiment in what would the kind of radical critique of bourgeois society look like without Marx, does the kind of lack of attention to that shift in these presentations mean that without Marx we can't adequately recognize the rising phenomena of alienation at a social level? Does Nietzsche not quite give us the equipment to talk of false appearances as themselves the only kind of access point to the essence in society, or is it just not the kind of thrust of your guys'?
The reason I said that Nietzsche was contradicting himself was that on the one hand he's a very acute diagnostician of modern society, on the other hand he doesn't quite fully bring around the question of how it might point beyond itself. Whereas for Marx, there is the concrete historical phenomenon of the workers' call for socialism. Whereas there's the Industrial Revolution, there's the rise of a new class, the proletariat, that has nothing to lose but its chains. Right, a completely expropriated class of labor is different from working classes of the past. The way Engels puts it in 1847 in his Communist Credo was that the working class after the Industrial Revolution is like no other exploited class in history. Like no other exploited class in history. We really have to emphasize that. Because it changes the character of all of history then. And yet Marx thinks that this new class, unlike any other exploited class in history, is on its way to abolishing itself. Right? And that, of course, is missing from Nietzsche.
Is it the exploited class that's fundamentally different, or the nature of bourgeois society is fundamentally different?
It's the nature of the exploitation which also changes what the class is. how the class is defined.
Then I guess one of the things, like when you think about Nietzsche's critique of socialism, I mean, he's actually critiquing socialism without Marx. Like the socialism that Nietzsche criticizes is the socialism that doesn't have the same degree of critical.
Well, but the reason I brought up
Socialism may never have had that.
Well, that's also true.
Socialism
Yeah.
may never have had Marx, and that's.
Meaning the only
That's
socialism
the-
that had it was Marx's own socialism.
Well, and those few who
Marxists,
followed,
right.
I mean, the final point that I'd make with respect to this revolution without Marx idea, because it was kind of a conceit, you know, this was Sunit's idea, but I came up with the title. And, you know, what I point out is that the Rousseauian concept of freedom drops out of the left, right, in favor of social justice, right? And the dialectic of the individual and the collective drops out in favor of collectivism, the left, versus individualism, the right.
Can you define social justice?
We all know what social justice is, right? It's status quo ante. Give the people back what capitalism has taken away.
Like indigenous communities?
Yeah, exactly. And that's not leftism, at least not historically. It's what passes for the left today, but that's why the left is dead.